Hi, I'm Harriet Frew, eating disorder therapist, teacher and podcaster, and you're about to start healing from your eating disorder and transforming your life and your relationship with food and body. I've worked in NHS and private practice supporting clients for 20 years, and I believe that recovery is possible for you. This podcast dives into expert interviews, evidence-based psychological approaches, and anecdotal tips from the therapy room from my years of experience. If you're wanting to heal your relationship with food, feel confident in your body, develop self-love and self-acceptance, and create a life of freedom and meaning, then this podcast is for you. Thank you for being here.
Today is another bite-sized episode and a question from a lovely listener. So my listener is very aware that some people in her life, some friends, colleagues, might have a problem with food or exercise or body image in some way, but often perhaps they don't realise it, or they recognise it to some degree, but they don't really think it's serious enough maybe to get help. And very understandable, I think, isn't it, in our kind of culture where these things are often minimised or overlooked. So she's asking, how can someone be supported to start in the early stages of their recovery journey? Now, I think before I jump into this, I want to say that I think it is really hard sometimes for people to get diagnosed. Obviously, many eating disorder services are massively oversubscribed, under-resourced. So, even if you recognise you've got an issue with food and body image, even if you get referred, you're not always able to get the help that you need. But I think as well, many people are suffering out there and don't even realise it, because disordered eating behaviours are very normalised in society. And I think, in kind of recent times, this has been an ongoing thing, but I think there's been a sort of resurgence of kind of the thin ideal, even thinner ideal again recently. And several celebrities have been posting on social media their very thin physiques. Possibly they're likely struggling with their eating, but it's not talked about at all, is it? And the outer presentation is very much celebrated and liked. And, there's no sort of evidence shown to the outside world that there might be suffering going on, but I guess it's very, very likely. And I think just having compassion for people as well who are in the limelight, there's so much pressure, isn't there, to look a certain way. And I think because of those messages are so full on and intense, and the thin ideal can be really reinforced by people in different industries, someone might not even realise they actually have a problem. They might just think, I'm just dieting, I'm looking after my body image and my physique, etc., etc. So, and I think also as well, if you're constantly getting that validation and acceptance for looking a certain way, it's really hard, isn't it, to recognise sometimes that you have a problem. But I think as well, it can be an awful position to be in. It really, really can. So this then translates, it's not just celebrities and famous people, is it? It translates into mainstream society. Diet culture is toxic and pervasive, and often as well, over-exercise is celebrated as being really, really healthy and fit, even if you are constantly injured, suffering from poor immunity and exhausted by your weary regime. Restrictive eating as well is celebrated as a moral, superior way of conducting oneself, never mind the exhaustion, lack of concentration, cold and poor digestion and loneliness. So it is all a bit effed up, isn't it? And no wonder people don't realise they have a problem with food and body image. Anyway, so it's a tricky one. And I guess if someone is at this moment in time very wedded to their what we might perceive disordered eating patterns and they are not ready to change, we can't force that change on them. And sometimes if we try to force the change on them, actually it can make things worse. I think often people do have to get to the point themselves when they're wanting change. And that can be really challenging when you're an outsider looking on, kind of knowing where this is all going to end probably, but, feeling almost paralysed to be able to do anything to help. But I think if someone even is not ready, you could still express concern, in a very sort of noticing kind of comment way rather than inflicting judgment or criticism on the person. You could just say, I've noticed that you seem a lot more preoccupied with food, or I've noticed that you don't seem so happy at the moment. I've noticed that you're worried about your body. You could just notice that gently and then leave it with them really if they want to talk about it with you or not. But I guess it shows that, you've opened a door then to enable them when they're ready maybe to be able to speak about it and open up. But I think sometimes we just have to let people get to that point themselves, but you can be quietly and supportive in the background. But what if you actually you yourself are ready to make a change, or you are ready to acknowledge that you have an issue with eating, or your friend is ready to acknowledge they have an issue with eating? So I'm going to talk about a few things there about how to get started now, because I think sometimes you can just feel really oh my goodness, I don't know where to start, what do I do? So I think what's helpful to say as well is that if your eating is causing you anguish, if you have become really preoccupied with food, if you're restricting your food or binging or chewing and spitting or purging or over-exercising or taking laxatives or diet pills, if you're obsessed about your body image and your weight, these are all signs and symptoms that need to be taken seriously. And you may have not considered that you have an eating disorder. You may have not considered that you even have disordered eating. You might think, well, I don't meet the sort of stereotype of what I think an eating disorder is. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that, possibly you don't have full-blown diagnostic eating disorder, but actually it could well be that you do have disordered eating or different signs and symptoms that are really impacting your life, and this needs to be taken seriously. I think what's really important to remember as well that 85% of people with eating disorders are not underweight. I'll just say that again, 85% of people with eating disorders are not underweight. So it's such a common thing that we hear people say, well, I'm not thin enough to have an eating disorder. Well, actually, if 85% of people with eating disorders are not underweight, it just really shows, doesn't it, that weight is only one factor in diagnosis, and many people are struggling with all these other behaviours that I've just talked about, but they look from the outside as though they're kind of normal weight, maybe overweight, but the signs and symptoms are not visible. But just because they are not visible to the outside world does not make your problem any less, and I think it's really, really important to say that. So if you recognise that you probably have got an issues with food and body image, one of the very first helpful things that you can do is just to talk to someone about it, to open up, to talk to someone that you trust. And I think it doesn't matter who this is. Obviously it could be a friend, it could be a family member, it could be someone in your life who's like a kind of mentor, supportive friend, aunt, distant relative, could even be a parent. It doesn't really matter who it is, but I think the important thing is that you open up to someone where you feel that it's a safe relationship, where you feel that they're going to listen, they're going to have your back, and they can just be supportive of you. So I think that can be one of the most helpful things, because actually even saying it out loud just reduces shame. It gets it off your chest, it makes it real, and that is scary, but actually that's the first step sometimes to be able to actually move towards getting help. Another thing you could do is visit the BEAT website, BEAT. So I'm talking here more if you live in the UK, but the BEAT website is the National Association for Eating Disorders in the UK, and you can go there and there's a sort of plethora of information where you can really just read up on eating disorders, just really educate yourself, and they've also got like a helpline, lots of resources, so that is a great place to start. Now, something else that you could also do is go and have a chat with your doctor. Now, I think it's really important to say that not all doctors are really educated and super aware of eating disorders. I think things are improving massively, but in the past, many doctors in their training got such a small amount of training on eating disorders that sometimes they are not very helpful. And I think particularly perhaps if you are, in a larger body, or you're suffering from binge eating, you may not be fully understood by all doctors. So I think if you are planning to go and speak to your doctor, it might be really helpful that when you phone up to book an appointment, that you ask to speak to someone in the surgery who has awareness of eating disorders and has some understanding and knowledge, because that is just really, really helpful, because having the sort of right supportive response from a GP can be massively, massively, massively validating and helpful. And, again, that can be really just such an important step on the journey. So what else can you do? Well, what you can do as well is just start listening to podcasts. So if you're listening to this one, obviously you're doing that already. Maybe reading books, starting to educate yourself. Possibly, if it is helpful to you, you could use social media in a helpful way. There's lots of people on social media who are in recovery and sort of posting educational, informative posts. I say with social media, you do have to be a bit careful. There's also quite a lot of material on there that's massively triggering. But I think if you sort of generally search for intuitive eating, body neutrality, eating disorder recovery kind of hashtags, you are more likely on the whole to find supportive content. And there is such a lot available these days. I think I'm very aware that when people come to therapy these days, they're often quite educated about some of the different skills and strategies that can be used in eating disorder recovery, because they've accessed it all on social media before already. So massively helpful. And you could even, if you're feeling ready, think about support from a coach or a therapist. And if you're looking, I'm talking again from the UK here, but if you're looking for NHS support through the National Health Service, your doctor would be able to refer you to a local service. But again, it would depend on you meeting certain criteria sometimes. And historically, eating disorder services have been incredibly under-resourced and often only able to take people on when they are super, super, super unwell, which is really invalidating for most other people who are struggling with eating disorders but then can't get the help. And not to invalidate anyone who is really, really struggling, understand, if you're really, really struggling, you need to be a priority and to be seen. But it also could be worth investigating private therapy as well. And I know we're in a financial crisis, and sometimes therapy can seem really expensive and almost like a luxury thing. But I think for many of us, we will spend money on beauty treatments or meals out or other things. And there is no price, I think, sometimes for your mental health. I know for myself, during my 20s, I had a lot of therapy, which I paid for myself because there just wasn't any NHS eating disorder support available back then. And it has been invaluable. I think without having that therapy, I would be in a very different place than I'm in today. So, I think it's worth thinking about and exploring options. And a lot of places as well will offer sort of like reduced rates if you're a student or on a low income. So it's worth exploring and investigating. And you could also talk to BEAT, the Eating Disorders Association, about that. So those are a few starting points. Now, something else that you might want to think about if you feel ready to try and understand your eating disorder or your eating issue or whatever it is that's going on, you could try and understand it a bit more from a psychological perspective. Now, if you would like to do this, you might want to grab a pen and paper and you can make a few notes as we're going along. What you might want to do as well is stop and pause the podcast in different places so you can sit and reflect and write things down. What you also might want to do is you might want to listen to the whole thing through first and then maybe come back to it when you've got a bit more time to really think about it and reflect on the things. It's really up to you. So on a surface level, I guess sometimes it can feel slightly crazy or confusing. Like, why can't I just eat? Why am I binge eating? Why can't I just stop exercising? Why can't I just accept my body? All these questions. So we have to remember here, as BEAT, the ED charity, says, it's not about food, it's about feelings. So you might be thinking, and I think this is very normal in our fast, quick fix, solution-based society, you might think, I just need a 3-step plan or like a meal plan or something just to help me get back on track and everything will be okay. But if you have an eating disorder or disordered eating, it is a psychological coping strategy and it tends to run a bit deeper than just being about food. So before you can even address your eating, you need to show yourself some compassion and understanding and just have a bit of a think about why might you be using food, not eating, or whatever disordered eating pattern you're in to cope and to explore this first. So you might be thinking, I have no clue. It just doesn't make sense. So don't worry, because I'm going to be talking you through bits and pieces of this. But I say to approach it as a scientist. Try and consider that even if right now you have no idea why you have developed these issues with food, just try and approach it as a scientist. Think about, I want to try and understand this better. Approach it with curiosity and compassion, not judging yourself. And once you begin to understand a bit more about why, it can open the door as well to consider different alternative and healthier coping strategies. So let's dig deeper into the possible whys. So I guess no one sets out to use food as a coping strategy. It's usually an unconscious decision. It becomes like a life raft to cling to when life throws turbulence and uncertainty at your door. So it's very helpful to view an eating disorder through this psychological lens, almost as a desperate attempt to survive and be okay. It's not just about selfish vanity or worrying about how you look. It's eating disorders run so much deeper than this. Of course they do. But I think when we can start to view the eating disorder through this lens, it opens the door to compassion and understanding about why you might be using food in this way. So initially, an eating disorder often offers respite and safety, whether it be through distraction, in controlling food portions, or numbing pain, maybe through emotional eating. But I guess what happens is, although in the short term you might get some relief from some of the other problems that are going on in your life, usually the eating disorder, the disordered eating, actually starts to cause more anguish and grief, and you almost have like another set of problems on top of what you were dealing with in the first place. So things can quickly unravel. And I think as well, what's tricky is once you're on this kind of disordered eating path and you're really preoccupied with food, it can feel really, really tricky to get off it, because of it's almost like, I think once we start to shift our relationship with food, we can't just like almost jump back across the river to the other side where we were before. It takes a few steps, sometimes several steps to get back to that point again. And particularly if we've been using food to cope for a period of time, again, I think the longer that we've been doing something or using something, the more it becomes habitual and the harder, again, it can feel to change. But I think I just want to say to people that, people recover from disordered eating issues after years. So don't lose hope, okay? It is always possible. So how can we understand a bit more about what's going on and dig a bit deeper into the whys? So what's really helpful first is to think about, going right back way before the eating disorder even started, and think about what factors have contributed to you developing a disordered relationship with food. So I think genetics definitely play some part. So I think it's sometimes hard to unravel what's genetics and what is environment. They become very, very sort of like interlinked. But there might be some genetic factors. So people with eating disorders tend to be people who are perhaps more anxious, maybe striving for perfection. Maybe there might be addiction or other sort of issues in the family. Often as well, people that are very sensitive. And I think that can be an absolute superpower. But I think all those things I've just said as well, environment can really play a role with all of those things too. So it's really tricky to untangle things. But I think, genetics play a role. So have a think about, what is your family of origin like? What's the genetics like? How do you perceive yourself? Are you someone who does feel anxious sometimes or striving for perfection, or are you sensitive? And these are generalizations. If you feel you don't meet any of those, it is fine, okay? Everyone is individual. Think back as well and think about your family environment growing up. What was it like in your family growing up? Did people get on? What was your role in the family? Were you the rebel? Were you the good child? Were you something else? Were extended family involved? Did people kind of get on in your family? Did people like each other? Was it calm and content in the home, or was it more turbulent and chaotic? And were there any significant events in your family, when you were growing up? Were there any bereavements, maybe any divorces or illnesses or issues with siblings? have a think about, what happened as you were growing up that may have just impacted your well-being and mental health. So did you experience any trauma or abuse when you were growing up? Because, if you did, this is probably very understandably going to have impacted your mental health, your well-being. And if you did experience these things, how was it dealt with? Did you have any support? Were there other adults looking out for you? What happened? Again, something helpful to reflect on. You might think, well, actually I had a really good childhood, there was nothing that I think really impacted me. I think everything was just, pretty good, and I have no complaints. But have a think as well about, were you able to express your feelings growing up? Were you able to feel heard and understood by people around you? Because I think sometimes as well, we can feel very loved by our families. We can have all our physical needs met, but sometimes for whatever reason we don't get our emotional needs fully met. And I think this is having compassion for parents, grandparents, etc. because of in the UK, I'm thinking particularly, and I'm sure this is true for many other places too, but I think back in the day no one really got any help with their mental health. No one really understood the importance of emotional validation and, mental health and emotional support and all these things. So we're often being parented by parents, and parents were parented by their parents, and they were people that had often experienced quite a lot of trauma or abuse or overlooking of their needs without any help. They just had to sort of suck it up and be fine and have the stiff upper lip and struggle through life with mental health problems sometimes without any support. So someone can only help you with your own, they can only parent you really based on the kind of parenting they have received, or if they've done a lot of personal development work on themselves. So it's just really helpful just to reflect really, what was it like at home? And your parents may have been doing the absolute best they could at the time, but if they were experiencing their own emotional wounding from their own upbringing, they're going to be probably bringing some of that into their relationship with you. It's just a very natural thing that happens. So have a think about that. And think about your early relationship with food and what was it like in the home? Were you allowed to have free access to food? Did you have regular meals prepared for you? Did you have anyone in the family who was dieting a lot? Was there any kind of weight stigma or fat phobia? Just reflect really on what it was like at home and just think about, how that might have impacted you. Because I think back in the day as well, it was just a very natural thing that, perhaps someone in the family would be dieting and then they would take their kind of teenagers along to diet club in their early teens and see that as a very helpful and normal thing to do, which, we know now that's extremely unhelpful and not very supportive at all. But, with the best will in the world, that might have happened to you, and that's going to have really influenced your relationship with food. Also as well, perhaps comments about your body. Was there sort of weight stigma? Was there fat phobia in the home? I think, there's a lot of stigma in society and a lot of unconscious stigma and conscious stigma. But we might have sort of grown up hearing a lot of talk about bodies, a lot of negative comments about certain types of bodies, and a lot of kind of comments on different bodies of different people in the family. And you might have even been labelled in relation to your body, like the kind of the tall one or the skinny one or the, I don't know, anything, that we can be labelled and pigeonholed from very young. Think as well about school. How did you get on at primary school? How did you get on at secondary school? Were you ever bullied? Did you feel that you fitted in? Did you have good friendships? So I think, again, if you're kind of growing up and you don't feel that you fit in, you feel a bit on the outside, you feel that you don't like yourself very much really, or maybe you feel like you just can't connect with people, that can really lead to a lot of feelings of low self-worth and a lot of isolation. And that can be quite a trigger sometimes for eating issues. So have a think about all of these things really, and then think about as well, how did you feel about yourself deep down, do you think, growing up? Did you feel good enough? Did you feel worthy? Did you feel deserving of good things? Did you feel lovable? Did you feel likeable? And these can be sort of called our core beliefs, how we feel about ourselves really deep down. So that could be helpful to think about, and to think about how you're feeling today about yourself. Do you feel good enough and worthy today or not? And if you don't, just try to, again, being the sort of scientist, think about, why is it that I don't really feel good enough? What is it that has really impacted me? And I think what's so important here is that how you feel about different situations is how you feel, okay? Now, someone in the past may have had no intention to hurt you, or they may have said a one-off comment with no thought about it and no understanding or consideration about how that may have impacted you. But if something hurt you and impacted you, and you experience some, sadness or anger or upset from that, then your feelings are your feelings. I think it's really important for you to validate your feelings and to recognize the things that really hurt you or impacted you growing up. And you don't have to be feeling rageful and blaming here. It's just trying to understand things better and to give yourself that kind of compassion and understanding. Now, often as well, what can happen is things happen when we're growing up. We develop these sort of core beliefs, and then often there can be a trigger event which then can set an eating disorder off. And sometimes it can be something like a really, really strict diet. Often it is combining that though with something else as well. So something like a life stressor. So it could be maybe a transition, like going off to university or changing school or moving across the country, or a bereavement in the family, or maybe your parents' marriage breaking down. There's usually something that's going on. It might be a relationship breakup, it might be a fallout with friends. It could be lots of different things that could trigger an eating disorder. And I guess what happens is, usually in the beginning, the eating disorder feels like a kind of good solution almost to a problem. I think in our culture, if we are struggling with anything, if you feel that you can diet and lose weight or have control over your body, that can feel like a really good thing to do. And I think often we have a honeymoon period of all of that as well, where things go really well. And you might have felt in the early stages before perhaps your eating disordered eating became out of control, that it was a really good thing, and you kind of liked the impact of the early days of it, and you may have felt that it boosted your self-worth and made you feel better. So the eating disorder is a coping strategy, and it quickly can become a habit and something that becomes a normal part of life. And unintentionally, you can then sort of get caught in very sort of perpetuating cycles with the disordered eating, which entrenches things further. So say, for example, if you are restricting your eating, then this starts to lead to binge eating, and then you don't like the binge eating, so you restrict your eating even more, and then you end up binge eating more, and it becomes like a cycle. And this can happen very easily, and sometimes then it can feel really hard to break. So so have a think about for yourself, was there a trigger event? Was there a trigger event that set things off? Because I think often things happen in our childhood which almost sow the seeds for perhaps low self-worth, or making us vulnerable to managing stresses or difficult situations, but then there's usually something that maybe triggers it off. And it's usually some kind of diet or wellness plan or intermittent fast, or something radical around food and changing the body, which is then often coinciding with a kind of stressful situation. And we're kind of probably using the dieting kind of as a distraction, a control mechanism, a way to numb painful feelings, something that makes us feel safe and secure. And then I think the final kind of piece of the puzzle is that, obviously we have these childhood things that influence us, the predisposing factors. We form these core beliefs. We then have the trigger event. But then what happens is you get into sort of the perpetuating factors. And what I mean by that is what keeps the eating disorder going, or the disordered eating going. So you get into cycles perhaps where you are dieting, being really strict with your eating, you end up binge eating, you end up over exercising, you maybe end up purging, you end up weighing yourself all the time, and all these behaviours really feed into each other. And it's really hard then once you kind of get in these cycles to kind of exit. And they all become very habitual as well, and can start to really take over your life in a very destructive way. Now, I'm very aware this is meant to be a bite-sized episode, and I think I am now going over 30 minutes, so I'm sorry it's not very bite-sized, but hopefully you're getting some value from it. So how do you feel looking back at your story? Have some reflection time on this exercise. And it can be hard sometimes, and I think you don't have to look at everything in one go. It might take some time to explore and work through things, and you can gently explore things bit by bit and at your own pace. And I think if you have experienced trauma or abuse or some things that are really difficult to maybe look at, it's really okay to just take things one step at a time. And, maybe that's something that you need to do in the safety of therapy. And you don't have to do everything in one go, because I think for all of us, it takes time for us to develop these issues over many, many years with lots of different experiences all adding up. So it takes a bit of time as well to begin to sift through some of this, and also just to be able to kind of process it, feel the feelings and begin to work on it. So be patient and kind with yourself. When you look back on your story as well, it might trigger some difficult feelings of loss or sadness. And you might feel angry or disappointed about certain things that happened. And this is understandable. And if emotions feel raw and intense, you might want to think about having some therapy at a later date, or even now if it feels the right time. And this might feel really, really daunting, but being able to process the past in a healthy way, although it's painful in the short term, it can bring so much healing and much better mental health and freedom going forward. And like I was saying earlier, I had quite a lot of therapy in my 20s, and it has made my 30s and now in my 40s just so much easier and so much more fulfilling. And I've been able to make better choices. I've been able to be a better parent. There's been so many positive ripple effects from getting support. And if you haven't had the best relationship with food and your body so far in life, it's likely because you've been coping unconsciously in the only way that you know how. It's been a survival mechanism. So as you reflect on your experiences, offer yourself compassion and understanding, and show yourself the kindness and respect you would to a good friend. And I think the really positive thing to say, or helpful thing to say, is to realise that you can learn new ways of coping. The eating disordered eating may be helping you cope right now, or may have helped you cope in the past, but you can learn healthier and kinder ways to take care of yourself. And sadly, there's not the kind of three-step quick fix plan which we would all like in eating disorder recovery. It is sometimes going to be one step forward, two steps backward. It's going to take a bit of time, because it's taken time for you to get to this point, so it takes time for you to heal as well. But work to embrace this sort of imperfection, this bumpy road, as part of the normal process of change, rather than seeing things in a very sort of black and white way as success or failure, or thinking that you've got to kind of snap out of it. The recovery road is imperfect and has many bumps along it. So other things that you might want to do to help you on this initial kind of stage of the recovery road is to think about your pros and cons of the eating disorder, the disordered eating. What does the eating disorder really give you? What does it really take away from you? And this is an exercise to work on your motivation, and it's also a way for you to understand your eating disorder better, so you can really understand why you are using it, because it may not seem very logical when you first explore this, but actually probably when you look at the different stresses that are happening in your life, or were happening in your life, that are probably not even food related, you can probably have some compassion and understanding towards yourself in realising why you have maybe used food as a way of coping. Also start to think about life in 5 years if you stay the same as you are now, life in 5 years if you change. Sometimes this can really help with our motivation to think about where we're going. And if you are feeling that you really want to make some steps and to begin the recovery road, you can even think about What are you going to get well for? What is it that you want to do? What's important to you in life? What experiences do you want to have? What relationships do you want to have? Where do you want to go? What do you want to be doing? What's your purpose? What brings you alive? What do you really, really enjoy doing? And it doesn't matter if you have no clue at this stage, but just try and connect on a very basic level and think about perhaps what you used to enjoy doing as a child, because that can be a clue into this. And also, if you feel like you want to make further changes, you could even start to think about having some structure with your eating. If you're in a restrictive eating cycle, you can maybe start to think about eating regularly, having a bit more balance with your eating, and just take a baby step with that. Start from wherever you are at. And I would say again, if you are doing things in relation to body image that are very triggering and unhelpful, things like weighing yourself lots or looking in the mirror and body checking or doing lots of comparisons on social media, see if you can start to reduce some of those behaviours, because of those things are going to really help, because whatever we focus on expands. So if you are weighing yourself, for example, multiple times per day, you're going to be having so many thoughts around weight, which are going to lead to a lot of feelings and behaviours, and it's going to kind of keep you in that cycle. Okay, so I hope that's given you a few things to think about. I hope you enjoyed the episode. And yes, if you're not following me already, do seek me out on Instagram at the Eating Disorder Therapist _. And for further support with your relationship with food, do go to the eatingdisordertherapist.co.uk. And if you enjoy this podcast, I would be so grateful if you would follow, rate and review, as it helps it reach so many more listeners.